Since Russia's first attacks on Ukraine in late February, dozens of journalists have been injured or killed while reporting on the war. Journalists are literally risking their lives to bring the latest news and information about the war to people around the world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to News Take. I'm David Shavrin, President and CEO of the News Media Alliance. Typically, News Take is where we talk about the latest innovation and really try to get into the weeds about trends taking place in the news media industry. But today we're going to focus on, frankly, a more serious topic, a more immediate topic, something that is literally affecting the whole world in this moment. And that is how journalists are covering the war Russia is waging against the Ukraine. Since Russia's first attacks on Ukraine in late February, dozens of journalists have been injured or killed while reporting on the war. Journalists are literally risking their lives to bring the latest news and information about the war to people around the world. So while we could talk about the latest news products, the dire situation in Ukraine is really the biggest thing happening in the world right now. And what we do as news publishers literally impacts what people know and how they perceive that war and the dramas and pain being experienced there in Ukraine. So we felt that it really needed and deserved immediate attention here. So over the next 45 minutes or so, our guests will share details about the situation on the ground there, including the needs of journalists and news organizations in Ukraine, as well as in Russia, and as well as how they are helping everyday citizens in Ukraine and staying safe, and frankly, what we outside of Ukraine can do to help. So with that, I want to welcome our guest, Carlos Martinez de la Serna, who's the program director at Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ. CPJ is an independent nonprofit organization that promotes press freedom worldwide, defending journalists' right to report the news safely and without fear of reprisal. During the war in Ukraine, CPJ has been providing support to journalists and media support staff through up-to-date safety and security information. In addition, they have been reporting on press freedom violations as they occur, including journalists who have been injured or killed while reporting on the war. Carlos has been with CPJ since 2018, and prior to that, he worked as a reporter and digital journalist in the US, Spain, and Japan, covering issues including current affairs, biomedical research, North Korea's nuclear program, and others. He is a founding member of the mapping startup Carto, co-founder of the nonprofit organization Por Casa, and former director of digital innovation at Univision News. Martinez de la Serna is a research fellow also at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University, and former John S. Knight Fellow at Stanford. There's a lot there. So, Carlos, let's start with just your story. Tell us a little bit more about your background, how you came to not only be at CPJ, but be focused on these issues.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David, for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm a journalist by career. I started in the late 90s in Spain when I was born, and I grew up. In the 80s in Spain, just to give a little context, it was a country where democracy was brandly new, and newspapers and media and journalism was, to me, a way of thinking about that too. So I grew up in a country that was becoming a new democracy, where media was also growing and expressing all the desires and ambitions of the society. So I became a journalist as part of that process. To me, it was part of an idea of a free society and a vibrant society as well. I worked in Spain for many years. I worked in Japan. I lived in different countries. I traveled throughout different places, mostly reporting on global health and world affairs. Then I came to the US more than 10 years ago. I did different things, but was my intention to, at some point, was very focused on working on journalism, but on mostly supporting press freedom and human rights. So I ended up at CPA, which is a great place to do so.
Fantastic. Some days we'll have to have a conversation about your reporting in Japan. That must have been a fascinating experience. I'd like to hear
So
more about
sorry,
that.
it's a country very close to me also because well, my wife is Spanish Japanese, so I have family there, and so my kids are also Japanese. So it's a place very close to my heart too.
But a lot of different environments, obviously, and one of the things about CPJ is you do get to have insight into journalists in a lot of different places and facing a lot of different kinds of challenges. So let's talk about uh, Ukraine in particular and what is going on there today. And again, thank you for talking to us now in this moment because this moment is really important. Can you just tell us? Let's start very broadly. Overall picture about what life on the ground is like for journalists of all types and from all places. What the environment like, what the reporting situation is like, and also I'm going to want to dive into reporters from different places who are doing different jobs. Certainly, you have
Sure.
Ukrainian journalists, you have Western journalists there to report. You have Russian journalists and what's going on in those environments. But very broadly, what is the environment like there for somebody who's trying to do reporting?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is it's very obvious is a situation of an armed conflict, but it's also probably the biggest press freedom crisis in 40 years. So it's not only is an armed conflict surrounded or in a context very complex, extremely dynamic. We are seeing challenges intertwined that some are on the ground, some are around the situation of the working journalist. So journalists are in the middle of that very enormous crisis. It has implications for how we think about journalism way beyond Ukraine and the region, but I think everywhere. But also they have to report, right? They have to report and fulfill its critical and essential role in bearing witness. So what we're seeing, I think, in Ukraine war is a lot of the threats that we've seen around press freedom and journalism converging and being or exemplified through in many different aspects. For journalists, it's a very challenging situation because of the dangers and the threats, because of the fluidity of the conflict. So, for example, journalists might every day need to check whether how they get to point A to point B in Ukraine, and the situation might be very different a few hours later. So, and that might represent a much bigger threat than what they expected. But also they're working in a very loaded conflict, right, with a lot of misinformation and propaganda around them. When their critical mission of bearing witness and building a record is essential for today and for the generations to come, and where there are new laws being enacted that make it more difficult their jobs, when there's a lack or there's been a lack of enough protective equipment for journalists reporting in the conflict zone. So it's a very, I would say, it's probably the biggest press freedom crisis in 40 years, where a lot of the threats and challenges we've seen are converging and being very evident to any observer, I would say.
That's a fascinating way to think about the situation for journalists there, because I guess at one level you have what happens in war zones and what's happened to reporting in war zones since there have been journalists covering war, right? Dangerous places, uncertain situations. But then it's also a very intense, and this is kind of unusual, intense media environment, right? You have, the invading country in particular trying very hard to generate its own flow of media information in ways that I'm not sure I'd have to think about it, whether we've seen that, and certainly haven't seen it in an era of social media and the intensity and speed of media. Yeah, interesting. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What sort of the competing narratives that and how that plays out on the ground of
Sure. Yeah. So I think if I take a step back, I would say that if you look at any conflict, any issue that's happening today in any place in the world. At the same time, there's extreme effort to control the narrative, which means a war on journalism, basically, in a very basic logic. So we go to Ukraine, you see those things happening in a extreme way. So what we see is that adding more risk to the situation. So you, besides the personal risk any journalist has seen when going to a conflict zone or to a war zone, now they are also being targeted sometimes directly as the enemy, because in this case Russia is doing as much as they can to control the narrative and to criminalize journalism, which is something we've been seeing for decades. But during war times, all the threats are way more clear and also much more obvious, also, right? Because they're direct to the journalists, right? So we see legal threats, we see technological problems in terms of accessing and being able to work. We are seeing mass displacement as a result of those things, of journalists, not only in Ukraine, but across the region, because journalists from other countries had sought refugee or asylum in Ukraine before. Now they're leaving the country also from Central Asia or Belarus or other places. Russian journalists also going into exile because basically the government there has imposed total censorship at the beginning of the war and continues to enact new measures and laws to make it impossible to just publish basic facts about the war and about the invasion. So that adds more dangers and threats to journalists on the ground, and also creates very long-term issues for media sustainability. So, as I said at the beginning of this brief answer, is if we think of any conflict as having an important component of a war on journalism, in this case, it's so obvious that is an important component of the invasion, which is not only the invasion itself, which is controlling even how we talk, how we think, how we judge and assess the consequences of the invasion. So journalists are at the core of that problem just by doing their jobs. And that's a very important message, I believe, and an alert for all of us that care about journalism, because what we're seeing in Ukraine is what we're seeing elsewhere, but during war, when things become much more obvious, much more dramatic, much more difficult to challenge.
So there's so much rich things to talk about there. In particular, it's kind of fascinating and I think we in the West haven't thought enough about Russian journalists, right? I mean, first of all, we tend to think of our own, and I want to talk about their experience and Ukrainian journalists' experience. But and sort of what you're describing with the Russian journalists, they're both the ones on site are subject to the violence of war and the dangers of war, but also they better report correctly. Otherwise, there will be a lot, danger and sanctions to them from the state. But also, Russian journalists in Russia who want to report on events in Ukraine. In a sense, they're also subject to another version of the violence. Just whether they're in Moscow or somewhere else, they are subject to still the violence of the state is expressed to them immediately. Right? It is they're trying very hard to make sure they commit various forms of violence against journalists everywhere. Is that a good, right way to think about it?
I think so. I think after 7 or 8 weeks already, sorry, I lost track of time of since the invasion started in Ukraine. One thing I would say is that I think it would be useful in some context at least, because I understand there are many dynamics here at play, including geopolitical analysis and consequences, but that the West-East framing doesn't work here. Because it's living out, it's removing a critical piece, which are journalists from those countries, and the same way as civil organizations and activists that are looking or striving and fighting for democracy and freedom. So that's the case in Russia, that's the case in Central Asia, that's the case in Belarus, that's the case in Ukraine. All those countries are directly affected by this war. So it's natural to look at the conflict, and it's very common to read the news and see West and the East. That's something that Putin likes to emphasize, because that's a framing that he feels comfortable with, because then there's a very clear enemy, like it's a kind of basic framing is West, that doesn't reflect the complexity of the thing and the societies that are directly affected by the conflict and the repression that are trying to overcome those difficulties. So there are a lot of journalists in Russia that are not able to do their jobs, but they would be, and they will keep trying to do their jobs under the most challenging circumstances. And the same applies to any country or any society across that, that's that part of the world. To me, that's very important to highlight, because this is not East and West. It's way more complex, and situations are much more intertwined. And that's how we limit our thinking in terms of the challenges, the problems, and potential solutions, and also how intertwined are some of those problems with our own societies. We cannot think of the Putin and invasion of Ukraine and things like that without thinking about how democracy is being challenged in some established democracies, and starting from the U.S. and the European Union, which this conflict is right at the core of the European Union's challenges and the backsliding of democracy within its members, including, for example, Hungary, or before that, Poland, which is in a very different situation because it felt threatened directly by Russia. So this is agitating all these preconceptions we had and all the frameworks we were relying on to try to understand things. And to me, it's more basic. It's about authoritarianism, trying to control the narrative and to impose a narrative over the others. And that includes its own people that are challenging that frame and that threat and those dangers, like Ukrainian journalists are doing, right? Ukrainian journalists are assuming major risk by keeping reporting on their own country, on their own societies. And then we will say Western reporters, but not Western reporters, are reporters from all around the world are going to Ukraine to also work witness and keep people informed. That basic thing, keep people informed, is a threat to authoritarianism, is a threat to Putin.
Yeah, so interesting. Let's dig in some detail with the experience of Ukrainian journalists in particular. So these are so they're in their home country, in a place of violence in which they are physically threatened, as well as their families and their homes are physically threatened. They are also working in terms of doing journalism while these threats are going on. Also at a time when very likely their employers, whoever their employers were before, are under extreme stress and may not be functional at some level, depending on the place and the capacity. So their support structures professionally are either highly stressed or evaporating. They also, I'm sure, want to report in Ukrainian language because they're telling their story of their place, but that also could serve to limit the scope of their storytelling. So they need to figure out ways to both tell their stories, but also get those stories heard in other places. Could you just talk a little bit about, again, the immediate experience of Ukrainian journalists trying to tell people what's going on where they live?
Sure. So I think you touch on probably all the dynamics at play here. So I would say, at a time when civilians are being called to join the army, basically, journalists are still reporting, right? And they're facing a bunch of challenges. Media sustainability in this context is just what it is, right? What is sustainability in this context in general? They're just surviving, the whole Ukrainian society. Of course, that's more severe in the eastern part of the country, while closer to the EU, it's, let's call it, safer, right? in places like Lviv or others. But in closer to Russia, which is way more challenging. So in that context, um, journalists have faced a lot of internal displacement. So they have left some of the most dangerous cities and places and moved to kind of safer places to be able to keep reporting, while others continue to be in the front lines, basically. Also, others have left the country, and then we are realizing what is becoming also a feature of the media, we can call it ecosystem globally, which is journalists under a lot of challenges and threats, figuring out ways to keep reporting by having people in country and people outside of the country, and having these hybrid media organizations that are reporting. In this case, many organizations are moved to other countries that are kind of safer, including Poland, when there's a big influx of refugees coming to the eastern border of Poland, which is the EU already. So, but they're relocating to other places. So we are seeing, as we have seen in other places around the world, news organizations setting headquarters or base outside of the country to be able to keep reporting inside the country and keeping reporting inside the country. But that basic media sustainability and ability issue is being enacted or protected by setting the headquarters or the base outside of the country. And then they're facing a lack of protective equipment. When there's not enough protective equipment, when every journalist is a war journalist, basically, right? When the whole country is under an invasion. That, I believe, that issue is becoming to be less severe right now, but it's week 7 or 8. Sorry, again, I should have checked since the start of the invasion. They're facing also the difficulties, the technical or logistical difficulties of reporting because of the attacks on media infrastructure, which is also potentially a war crime. And we have documented at least 4 attacks on media infrastructure, which limits their ability to keep reporting, because it's for example, radio is a critical medium in a situation like this. So of course, it's not limited to the borders. So again, on what you mentioned about the importance of local reporters and about on the importance of their work being able to be accessed and read or listened to outside of the country, radio is essential. It can there are ways to circumvent censorship that are using that they can rely on, while there's a lot of difficulties in terms of internet, in terms of other, like, let's call it more modern technology. But radio works under very challenging circumstances. So there's a mix of situations, and what we are seeing in Ukraine, I think, is going to be a learning for decades in how some things we have seen in recent years in other places. Others is like the perfect storm, because we cannot avoid mentioning that Russia, and Putin specifically, has been one of the leaders of the creation of the new authoritarianism. So it's not only that he's applying things from other countries, now he's setting the standard for other countries to copy and to follow and enact similar laws, similar regulations, similar propaganda machines that include news organizations that in some aspects are news organizations, in others are propaganda machines. So this perfect storm is the context for Ukrainian journalists that have resorted to all types of potential solutions and alternatives, including setting up news outlets or in English to expand their impact, and also which makes them even more critical. So that I believe is a situation. They have faced all types of threats. We've seen cases of journalists being attacked during 7 weeks. We have at least documented 7 journalists being killed. We documented some of them that were tortured. You can imagine this is a dramatic situation.
It's one of the really interesting things you talked about is essentially you talked about sustainability, but if your support system, everything from your office to printing presses or internet connection or getting paid, right? In this situation, we're going to talk a little more about what publishers outside of Ukraine can do to help. But it sounds like one of the key things that it's kicked in has been helping to create some external support infrastructure to support the journalists in Ukraine, right? Because their support
Definitely.
system is
Yeah.
evaporated in many cases.
I think you asked me at the beginning what was briefly my story. I would say my journalistic career has also been the story of a, a new media world, right? The emerging of a new media world with all the challenges and opportunities. For the publishers, I would say something. Sustainability, which is key, right? We want to make our businesses sustainable at the most basic level to be able to continue to do journalism, includes press freedom. Without press freedom, which is obvious, right? But in a time of stability and a time of things going well, we might forget that without press freedom, there's nothing. No, you cannot achieve even basic sustainability. You don't exist. You cannot do your jobs without press freedom. So that's basically what we're seeing in Ukraine. But it touches on every aspect of a media organization, including how to keep supporting your journalists, what is the media infrastructure that is needed for that. And in this case, what we're seeing is hybrid organizations of journalists in exile, journalists on the ground, which is not new to Ukraine, but is at a scale that is bigger than probably ever. But we've seen that in Myanmar, we see that in Nicaragua, we see that in many other places in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are examples that precedes this case, but now it's a feature of the system. Permanently, we're seeing news organizations from the beginning being created with in exile to be able to report on their own countries and societies. And so we need a new infrastructure to support that. We need, for example, visas. We need visas for journalists to be able to report outside of their countries. We need to be able to integrate them into media networks inside the countries that probably were designed at the beginning to include journalists with other language skills or with other even expertise or a totally different setting, right, or characteristics. So we're seeing that, and we're seeing also the need for traditional media organizations that might not be confronting those challenges to adapt and to understand those features of the new media world that are as important as the opportunities created by the internet and the challenges. So we cannot dissociate sustainability from press freedom. That's a critical thing. I think there's an important reminder from this conflict. It was already obvious for journalists in Venezuela, for journalists in Cuba, for journalists in Nicaragua, for journalists in Ethiopia. I can keep going, or Myanmar, or Thailand. So there's a lot of expertise out there. This is a wake-up call, I would say, for journalists in countries that have enjoyed a more solid and I would say sustainable democracy to look, this is the reality of the media business too. So press freedom is also a base attacks or undermines, when it's under attack, basic sustainability, right? So I think that's what we can learn from Ukrainian journalism, from Russian journalists, which has been the feature for many journalists around the world. But again, this is I wouldn't say a wake-up call, but the last wake-up call, sorry, to be a little bit dramatic.
Yeah. And with respect to Western journalists who are going to do war reporting, right? We have a mental model of that about how difficult that is and what that's like, but also a model often not followed, but where there's some hope that the press is allowed to be there without being seen as a combatant by one side or the other. But in this situation, at least my perception is that Western media is viewed as a hostile party to Russian forces. Is that accurate? Is that how they feel there? Is that how they're treated?
I think any journalist and media is seen as hostile by Russian forces, and it's very clear how they reacted to that by enacting laws that would imposes fines and sentences of up to 15 years in prison just to call a war a war. So any media is hostile is seen as hostile by Russian forces. For journalists outside of Ukraine, regardless of where they're coming from, they still play a critical role because the world needs to pay attention to that, and they're explaining that to their audiences in a way that probably it's how they will. It will be easier for them to understand the nuances and the problems of the conflict. They're bearing witness again, and that basic. We need as many witnesses as possible in something like this, right? That for today and for the record, for historical record for generations to come. So they're exposed basically to this same conflict, though this is not their country. They usually have a way out. They're not facing exile, but in terms of personal risk, they're at the front lines as well. They're and also journalists used to report on conflict zones. They're very invested in these conflicts, so there's a highly emotional toll for them as well. We cannot differentiate in this case by being local or not. You're exposed to different things, but the human toll and the impact of that is really enormous. What I would say from the side of the publishers or the news organizations is, what can we do to support them, right?
Yep.
It's help them, give them the best information we can about the situation on the ground, the evolving situation. A critical thing when reporting on a situation like this is to try to anticipate as much as possible any potential issue you might face, so you can try to you're ready to mitigate the consequences if you cannot prevent it. So that requires a very thorough risk assessment and information sharing and updating. And you need the best protective equipment and training to be able to confront very challenging situations that include physically being challenged and emotionally. So it's not a job for experienced journalists, of course, but also there will be younger journalists that will have the thrive and the desire to go there. They need the same type of information and support. There are informal, I would say, networks of journalists that at the end up working together in this kind of conflicts. Those networks are very important because they support each other. They mentor younger ones. They teach them and they help build also like a record of the challenges for this conflict, let's say, compared to recent in Syria or Yemen or Libya or other conflict zones that the foreign reporters have, or war reporters have covered recently in the last 10, 15 years. So those things are very important from our side for a side like a press organization, news organization would be to how can we keep supporting, do our best to support them. That includes thinking about the networks, supporting networks at home, and again, information sharing, working collaboratively. This is very conflict, much bigger than any of us, so we need to work together, and that's the situation. Probably a new or kind of newsy component here is the role of disinformation that everyone is confronting, and the role of technology, not only in digital technologies, not only in enabling us to do a lot of stuff, including communicating in very challenging circumstances, but also poses their own risks in terms of authorities of any kind being able to access your records, your documents, putting your sources at risk to.
Yeah, again, the sort of other front in this war of this disinformation and information war going on over top of the physical war at the same time. And essentially, journalists are working and risking their lives every day to not only bear witness to truth, but also essentially to push back against this disinformation campaign going on at the same time. You had touched on what can publishers and journalists outside of Ukraine do to help. And with that, I'd like to dig into just some very practical questions about journalists working to cover things in Ukraine. I was on a call the other day where there had been a call for newsprint to be moved into Ukraine. they had gotten newsprint. I guess some of the sources had been from Russia previously, and you can be sort of cynical about newsprint, but the fact of the matter is, if you are trying to tell important facts and truths to people, particularly in Ukraine, what's happening in their neighborhood and what's happening where the troops are moving. I'm sure internet connections are difficult. You have Russian disinformation coming in. Maybe in many respects, being able to print something and get it to people is actually a compelling thing. But just in terms of the immediate practical needs of what journalists and frankly publishers who want to communicate to people in Ukraine about what's happening, what are some of those immediate practical needs that you hear about?
One immediate practical needs is for all types of organizations, but that includes the biggest bureaus you can think of, or news organizations, to figure out how to keep reporting when Russia takes control of something. That's extremely challenging. So we've seen news organizations live in Russia because of the new laws, so they're not able, no longer able to keep reporting on Russia, and they're currently reporting on Ukraine. But when a city falls under the control of Russia, then that's no longer the case. And we read a story about two AP reporters that were the last ones to stay in Mariupol in Ukraine. They kept reporting, but they were being sicked by Russian authorities, according to their testimony. Mm-hmm. So there's an immediate practical thing. I am aware news organizations are discussing and sharing information among them about how to keep reporting when either the threats are directly from Russia, like in a city controlled by them during a war conflict, and also, but when laws are enacted that are making it impossible to keep doing journalism. Those are direct implications as of today that news organizations are considering. Other one is the problem of journalists in exile. So what happens when you have journalists that had to leave the country where they were reporting on? They might be local journalists working for, let's say, a big newswire, or any other organization. They had to leave their countries. They need to keep reporting. They are now confronting all the problems of having journalists in exile. They can no longer go back to the countries and keep doing journalism. That's another direct implication that today they're confronting. Other one is how to cut through the fog of misinformation. That's always challenging, right? That adds another safety problem to your journalists, because they're being targeted not just as journalists, but as someone who's confronting the authoritarian version of the events. So now they're being targeted as combatants to some extent, right? So they're confronting those challenges too, and how to protect their journalists under these very difficult and extremely challenging circumstances. So I'm aware news organizations are having these conversations, they're sharing information, they're working together, and the problem has only begun, I would say. The problem, journalists in exile, we still don't know the scale of the problem, but it's going to happen with journalism in Russia in the next weeks, and when the war eventually ends. What's going to happen in Ukraine? What kind of journalism are we going to see as the conflict evolves? What's going to happen in a country like Belarus, which is under Russian support, let's say, but it's been under attack for a year and a half? What's going to happen in Central Asia? So the problem, I'm afraid, has only begun. As I say, this is the biggest press freedom crisis. And the same way wars have long-lasting consequences, they will have, and they're already having it on the press freedom side of the events, which is, again, at the core of the conflict.
I do want to dig in just, if we could, just because I think it's so important on the disinformation campaign. Yeah. One would you could say, well, a Russian news outlet is promoting a flatly incorrect story as a part of disinformation. But could you tell us a little bit more about all the ways? It's sort of the obvious one when it's, a Russian news agency saying something. But what are all the less obvious ways that you see the Russian government trying to infiltrate the narratives, not only in
Yeah.
Ukraine, but in the West and in Russia and other places in ways that are less obvious than just from the Russian
Well,
news service.
I think the less obvious and most insidious way of propaganda is by making everyone question the veracity of news.
Mhm.
So when and this is something that's been built up for decades already. So uh, Russia has been very systematic about supporting propaganda in many ways by having news organizations that are in some ways doing news, legitimate journalism, in others not, but that by mixing things up, making very difficult to discern what is propaganda, what is not. So our societies, when there's a lot of documentation about potential human um, violations or in war, the first question within our societies is some part of society is questioning the validity of those documents. That's the most insidious propaganda because if some people are not even aware they're contributing to that propaganda. And then we can think of the different aspects. For example, we should think we don't know because it's a black box in many ways how a platform like Facebook is confronting the challenge of propaganda. We don't know, and that's a big problem because we might know a year from today, 2 years from today, 3 years today. It will be important to know, but it's useless as of today in how we confront the problem, how we protect journalists, how we help the public get access to accurate information. The transparency reports from from these type of organizations are completely disassociated from the real needs on the ground, which make me think, and I'm going to be very clear, they're just PR exercises, not just legitimate exercises to try to collaborate with all organizations in creating a sustainable. Sustainability is also about making sure we have the ways to share information and have a proper discussion around public events, which is very hard when those are mixed with propaganda in ways that we cannot even discern what's propaganda, what's not, which is a case for a lot of people in our society. So the implications of the most insidious propaganda is that we'll live in a news ecosystem that is no longer conducive, I would say, for factual news and accurate news, but it's also mixed up with other types of information that are created with a totally different purpose in mind, which is creating this kind of confusion. And there are very direct implications here, which is not for the news organization itself, but how we're thinking about protecting legitimate news organizations, which is not that, of course, there's a big opportunity to have a lot of different opinions about something, but all of us trying to pursue some factual reporting, right? Some basic reporting that's been built, also the methodologies have been there for decades, not that we're inventing anything. And also, in part of the ecosystem, we have platforms that are black box. They're driven mostly by business. They're not fine. You can have any business goals in your life, but not linked to the sustainability of the media ecosystem, which is what we need. And what the Ukraine war also makes very evident is that we need very good information in order to not just to protect our societies, to protect the freedoms, basic freedoms we rely on. And that was also very evident during COVID, during the public health, which is, it's still with us, right? But it's even more evident now with Ukraine. So it's a very complex situation that I believe news organizations and are confronting, which is at the core of sustainability. I think we can think of sustainability in many aspects and include like challenges to your very existence, right?
Yeah, it really gets back to your initial and very powerful point that what's happening in Ukraine is intense and immediate, but many of the underlying dynamics are threats to press freedom that we see around the world and in many places. They've just been sort of focused in this
I
intense
believe
place.
so. I will mention a former colleague of mine. So Joel Simon, who was the executive director for the Committee to Protect Journalists for, well, he was with us for 15 years. Now it's no longer. So I can quote him, right? I know blame me about anything. But I remember when I joined CPA, I read Joel has written several really good books, and he has explained these elements. But there's a paper he wrote 10 years ago, I think, or more than 10 years ago, about Russia and the creation of authoritarianism. So you can go back, read that, and see that at play today. And what Joel did was rely on the experience of organizations like CPA, Press Freedom, advocates around the world. We've been seeing these for many years, and in many occasions with very close collaborations with these organizations that are absolutely aware of this. But we need others to be aware of this. We need governments to be aware of this. We need to be aware why Trump is a threat, is an existential threat, not to news organizations, but to us. We need to understand what Putin, what the far right doing in Europe. We need to understand how information and the control of information is a critical piece of all those things. So what we've seen in Ukraine is everything exploding and converging. But unfortunately, we've seen all these threats happening at least for 15, 20 years now.
Carlos, you've been tremendous and very generous with your time. I just want to thank you very much. Not only thank you very much for sharing all of your thoughts and important information with us, but for doing what you do every day and fighting for press freedom. So from News Media Alliance, I want to thank you very much, and we hope to have you back in the future to talk about not only what's happened in Ukraine, but also these other broader challenges to press freedom everywhere.
So I'm happy. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, thank you.